Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review, this time of the division's 1st Pancerna and 3rd Fallschirmjager, requested specifically about a month ago by Leo Reinhardt, although 3rd Fallschirmjager has been a popular request for some time now by several different viewers. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific divisions covered in this series, leave them in the comments section below, and I will either route you to where they already exist or get to them in chronological order. Without further ado though, let's hop right into my first iteration of the 1st Pancerna division. Now, this is my second week in a row reviewing a Polish division, and it's starting to wear on me. The Polish divisions have never quite been my favorite, and they certainly suffer in quite a few ways that I find very, very crucial, so kind of begins to form a bias there for me. Beginning in the Recon tab, I grabbed a card of Phase A Cromwell 4 Recon tanks. And in Phase B, I brought in the Stuart 5 Recon. This is mainly because it didn't have any excellent recon options that were infantry or any really fast recon options that I was really sold on, and so I just decided to steer into the skid and grab some more tanks. The Cromwells typically did alright, however the Stuarts actually ended up growing on me throughout the week. Just having an extra set of Stuarts past the ones that I was bringing in the tank tab was actually quite nice. In the infantry tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the defense groups. I call them defense groups because that's practically all they are. They're just 2 Brens as well as a bunch of rifles, and more or less for 15 points they did the job that I wanted them to do. And that typically boiled down to either holding spots that I wasn't going to be actively advancing on, or just holding spots behind the bulk of my actual line infantry without needing to take too many hits, but still being able to support in the combat to come. Honestly, if these guys were even 5 points more expensive, I likely wouldn't bring them in, just because they don't offer a lot of usability or survivability. However, being that they're 15 points and they bring in 2 Brens, I think they're an excellent option to bring in to support your other infantry, but not much else. I also brought in a Phase A card of the Strelki, leading to one of the lightest Phase A infantry tabs that I've had in quite a while. Being that this deck is so starved for infantry, I decided to just kind of deal with it for Phase A and maybe make up for it in Phases B and C, and for the most part it was only a struggle some of the time. In Phase B, I bring in another card of the Strelki as well as the card of the Sappery. Now, the Sappery were actually quite good. I can't say anything bad about them. These are practically almost the same as the French Sappers that are available in 2E Blindé. However, these guys feature a bazooka, they come in the armored half-tracks with the Dushka mounted to the top, and they're also really, really good at clearing out close quarters infantry with their TNT. Because of all these factors, I decided to delay them until Phase B, though a case could be made to bring them in Phase A instead and just kind of use them to help your initial push. I just wanted as many as possible, and so I brought them in at B. Felt like a nice compromise between numerosity and usability. In Phase C, I rounded it all out with the Strelki and the Dragoni, and I will say for the record that the Dragoni upset me more often than not. These guys do have an anti-tank option in the form of the Piat, and the Piat is supremely ineffective in my hands. Being that it only has the base 50% accuracy, I oftentimes find myself just relying on it too much and missing those crucial shots that I really needed to hit, and because of that, it just led to a lot of frustration with these units. What's more, aside from the Sappery teams, this deck actually doesn't get access to any what I'd consider decent anti-tank infantry in the form of things like Panzerschrecks, Rezedka, or anything with another bazooka other than the Sappery teams. There's the option to, of course, bring in more Piats, but I am not that much of a sadomasochist. My advice for using these guys is to not rely too heavily on their anti-tank capacity, or to use them in pairs as to more or less guarantee the hit with the law of averages. If you bring them up as line infantry first and then they happen to kill a tank, it's a lot more satisfying than bringing them up for the sole purpose of fighting those medium tanks that you're likely to see in a city or in a forest engagement, and just watching as they fail time and time again. Moving on to the tank tab, I have a Phase A card of the Stuart 5, which I feel like really speaks for itself. The Stuart 5 has an excellent armament for the price tag associated with the tank. It moves very, very quickly, and it comes in at excellent availability even at Phase A, so there's really nothing I could say about the Stuart that hasn't already been said. I also bring in a Phase A card of the Sherman 3 Leaders, and these are namely to provide veterancy not only to my tanks, but also to my infantry, as I lack any sort of infantry commander or infantry leader until Phase B in this division. I finish out my Phase A tank tab with the Firefly 1C, and these guys come in at the Force 2-star veterancy, but still at 2 per card, so it's fairly decent availability for that veterancy. For the most part throughout this week, the Fireflies ended up impressing me quite a bit, and that isn't to say that I haven't used them before, but instead, I haven't played this division too often, and typically speaking, the Fireflies that I do get in other divisions are quite limited, so I don't see their usability a lot. They are a bit finicky and require a bit more micromanaging due to their relatively low armor per penetration, but you know what, they ended up doing their job more often than most other units in this division, so I can't be too upset with them. In Phase B, I brought in the card of the Cromwell 7s at no star veterancy, and this was mainly because I don't rely on my Cromwells to actually hit anything. The Cromwells were simply there just to absorb shots, and this is because they have the highest front armor available in this division. I was just basically using these guys to bait the shots from Panthers or Tigers and then sneak the Fireflies up on them on multiple angles in order to guarantee the kill quickly. For the most part, these guys would survive 1 or 2 shots from a Panther without too much trouble, and I just kind of use them like that. 60 points is kind of a really easy decision for me to make to just throw away a vehicle, especially when it's in favor of holding on to a Firefly for a little bit longer. I would really love to not use the Fireflies in a frontline scenario where they're going to be actually accepting shots, as they're likely to be penetrated by Stugs or Panzer IVs, let alone the heavier tanks that I'm sending them to deal with. I also grab a Phase B card of more Sherman 3 leaders, as well as a Phase B card of 1-star Firefly 5s. I bring them in at 1 star because I really don't want these guys to miss under any circumstance, and so between the leader and the commander buffs, it's going to bring it up to 3 stars. In Phase C, in my initial deck, I just kind of rounded it out with 2 more cards of Firefly 5s. Now, I didn't think about it at the time, and it looks kind of silly looking at it in retrospect. However, I didn't bring in any real medium tanks. I kind of just had a bunch of Fireflies and the Cromwell. And so because of that, there was a redesign really needed after even 1 time playing this division. However, we will get to that when we get there. In the support tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the Vickers, and they're fine, they're Vickers. I can't really say anything too terrible about them, as they only cost 20 points, but they're certainly not my favorite infantry support gun. I also brought in the Phase A card of the Cromwell 7, and weirdly enough, I was using this as a frontline vehicle almost exclusively, bringing it up with my blocks of tanks, as it does feature quite a bit of front armor, being that it's a Cromwell 7. Now, I wasn't callously throwing this thing away, but I was still bringing it up quite often with the block of tanks that I was actually pushing up, so use that at your own discretion. However, you could also bring in a much lighter and cheaper commander and just kind of hide it behind the front lines. I don't know why I did this, it just felt interesting and I hadn't done it before, so I decided, what the hell. In Phase B, I rounded all out with the Bedford supply truck as well as the Cromwell 6, and the Cromwell 6 actually really impressed me also. I was bringing this in to just kind of harry infantry from afar, and for the most part, it did that job in spades. For 40 points, this guy would harass enemy infantry to such a degree that I almost didn't need the Vickers, and I ended up dropping the Vickers for that very reason. In the anti-tank tab, I grabbed a Phase A card of 6-pound guns, a Phase A card of 17-pound guns, Phase B in the same thing, and Phase C of the 17-pound guns alone. Now, the anti-tank tab in this division is actually quite solid. I really enjoy the 6 and 17-pound guns respectively, just because they only feature that AT capability, but they really excel at it. The 17-pound gun is a little bulky and does get spotted quite often, so I tend to enjoy using the 6-pound gun a little bit more, especially because it has the added usability of APCR as well as the AP rounds. Not only that, but it is practically invisible until it's fired at least once or twice. Now, the Firefly is great, don't get me wrong, but I was using this many AT guns to try and form overlapping fields of fire to get side armor shots onto Tigers or Panthers that might be engaging my tanks at front armor. This is mainly because while the Firefly is fantastic, it isn't going to do much against a Tiger at 2 kilometers. Sure, it has a penetration chance, but more often than not, the Tiger is just going to kill the Sherman before the same happens in reverse. Because of this, I think your best bet with this division, or any division that relies on the Firefly to hit things, is to have overlapping fields of fire of 17 or 6-pound guns to really help it along before your Shermans die. In the anti-air tab, I went with the fairly simple Phase A, B, and C cards of the Bofors self-propelled guns, and they were for the most part pretty good. I really enjoy the Bofors as a unit, and it was just on wheels, so it's not like it could get any worse. However, it did help keep up with the armored pushes, and being that it was at a forced 1-star veterancy, it was typically at 3 stars whenever it was firing at enemy planes. In the artillery tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Sherman 140mm off-map observers, as well as a Phase B card of the artillery commanders, and these guys were just there to buff my infantry in the late game. As I didn't have any real radio-guided artillery in the initial part of this deck, I was just using these guys as infantry commanders that didn't come in the infantry tab, as the infantry tab is very, very, very niche to this division. It would be very difficult for me to justify bringing in an infantry leader in the actual infantry tab, just given how expensive the tab gets and how exclusive the tab is to only being able to bring in units. In the air tab, I brought in a Phase B card of the Mosquito HE bombers, as well as a Phase C card, different armaments, but again, the armament hardly matters. I was just using these to delete spots on the map should I need it, and a Phase B card of the Mustang Mark III. Now, the Mustang intrigued me right off the bat. It is almost as quick as the Tempest, being a full 10 kilometers an hour slower, but that felt like a reasonable trade-off for me given the much, much cheaper aspect of this plane. What's more, it features a fairly decent agility and a fairly decent armament to boot, so I thought it was going to be as good as the Tempest, if a little bit worse, and for the most part I was right. These guys didn't let me down too much, however they weren't fantastic in any one regard, so I don't know if I'd recommend them quite as highly as I would the Tempest. For starters, they are a bit squishier than the Tempest. I found that these guys oftentimes went down after 1 or 2 flights, and I'm not a huge fan of planes that just go down after a time or 2 of being in the air. That said though, they really did help with the Bofors, and so long as I was being aggressive, the enemy typically had no time to set up an AA net, so it kind of worked out. Moving on to this deck at the end of the week, and we don't see any changes until we jump into the tank tab. To my credit, I realized my missing medium tank problem right away and ended up dropping a Phase C card of the Firefly 5s in favor of a Phase B card of the Sherman 5s to help me with having Shermans in every phase. I felt like this was exactly what this tank tab needed. I had plenty of Fireflies, but oftentimes I was just to a point where I only had Fireflies to function as every single tank role, and while it will do the Sherman's job just as good as the Sherman, it's 30 points more expensive to do the same thing effectively against infantry, so trading this out just made sense. I also, in the support tab, as I alluded to earlier, dropped the Phase A card of the Vickers in favor of just using the Cromwell 6s to do that same job. In the anti-air tab, I dropped the Phase B card of Bofors on the wheels in favor of stationary Bofors just because I needed a few more AA guns I found throughout the week. I needed some things that could hide in forests or hide in cities feasibly, and so I ended up just swapping over to these for one card, and it ended up working out quite well. In the artillery tab, I also brought in some of the Sextons in Phase B, and this was mainly to capitalize on my abundance of radios that I had scattered around cities, but also just to help me deal with enemy anti-aircraft weapons that were shooting down my Mustangs more often than I would have liked. While this is the final version of this deck, I did end up experimenting with quite a few other things, one of the most notable being bringing in the Morris in the Recon tab in Phase A to kind of rush up with my early infantry and perform the same role that I would use a PTRS team for. Where this differs from a PTRS team is mainly in the fact that it is infinitely slower at 85 kilometers an hour on road, and the boys cannon is significantly less reliable and significantly less stealthy, so I ended up dropping these guys in favor of literally anything else. I also did experiment with the infantry tab, dropping a few things here, maybe bringing in some more leaders here and there, but honest to God, these infantry just aren't good enough, with the exception of the Sappery, to really get leadership and benefit from that leadership. Don't get me wrong, obviously they get the fire rate and the accuracy boost, however, I was just using these guys as fodder to identify targets for my Sherman horde, and not really to do anything intelligent with them. Perhaps this is a failing on my part, but I found that this deck's strongest asset, and rightfully so as it's an armored division, was its tank tab. And so steering into having really strong infantry as well as having really strong tanks felt like a mistake, and I should just choose one or the other. That said, the reality is the Sherman is just as good an infantry squad as any infantry squad there is. It will obliterate infantry that it actually finds, and barring a few exceptions, infantry have a lot of trouble dealing with the Sherman in general. Because of this, like I said, I would send up a squad of Strelki, identify targets with them, and then blow them out of the water with the Sherman, so to speak. I found that this deck really benefited from the critical mass syndrome, in that you bought a few Shermans, and if you managed to keep those few Shermans alive, then you bought a few more Shermans. Then if you managed to keep those alive, so on and so forth, until Phase C hits and you have something like a block of 11 Shermans and 4 or 5 Cromwells that are kind of advancing on the enemy lines. Because of this, and I think this is exclusively true of only certain tanks in the game, however the Sherman is most likely the foremost among them, you would end up with this multiplicative force multiplier of just multiple Shermans advancing toward the enemy. So long as you manage to keep them well supplied so that they never ran out of the 14.5 ammo or their main cannon ammo in some instances, I found that these guys really just promoted a rolling scenario, in that once you started pushing with them, there was almost nothing the enemy could do to stop them. Enemy anti-tank weapons against 11 Shermans aren't going to do much. They're going to fire one time, get spotted, and then 11 Shermans are going to fire at them, quickly obliterating them. Enemy tanks aren't going to do much because you have a ton of Fireflies out there, so they're just going to obliterate those as well. And due to the sheer numerosity of them, you were unlikely to suffer any losses just through the target-rich environment that you're creating. I also found that this deck really excelled in a lot of the same areas that the NATO divisions excel in, such as light forests or something like that. The Sherman is an excellent forest machine, and on top of that, they have access to a lot of the same M5 half-tracks that you see in the 2nd Indian Head or 3rd Spearhead deployments. I tested this quite extensively on Lenina, just running up through that forest in the 4v4 version of the map, and typically speaking, this deck was unbeatable in that scenario. Shermans themselves lend themselves very heavily toward that area, and on top of that, their infantry kind of excel at being meat shields long enough for the Shermans to get there. What's more, the off-map artillery in this division is actually quite usable, and right after that you have access to a Sherman that, while it lacks its main cannon, still has access to quite a few other things to help support your infantry, and potentially piss off the enemy because they see an off-map vehicle on the map. All that praise aside, there are areas that this division kind of lacks in, honestly. I like the Fireflies and I like the usability that they promote. Their ability to kill enemy heavy tanks is actually quite amazing given their stats. I know that their stats look impressive, but they act even more impressive than that in my findings, so I can't really take anything away from the Fireflies. However, that's really all there is to this division, is the Firefly. Their 6-pound guns in this division lack the APCR shells found in the NATO versions of the same weapons, and so they lack usability there. On top of that, their AA tab is fine, it really doesn't sell anything, it doesn't do anything special, and as I've mentioned quite a few times, their infantry tab isn't anything to write home about either. To bounce back one more time, however, I can't think of another division that fills all the same gaps that this one does. In a lot of other instances where I say something isn't the greatest, it's because there's another option that I think would be better or easier to use for any player that wanted to use them. However, this is the most availability for any Firefly in the game. The next is 3rd Canadian Mechanized, and that only gets access to 8 at most, so if you want to use the Firefly in all of its glory, then this division is really the only one that you're going to get access to. I just don't know that the Firefly alone is enough to make this division playable. It's perfectly playable, I guess that's kind of an overstatement. However, it does lack in a lot of key areas that I find very, very crucial toward early and late game pushing. It lacks any of the late game spam to win any wars of attrition, as it were, and it lacks a lot of the early game pushing power to push through something that's actually quite ready for you. If the enemy has a strong anti-tank presence and a strong recon presence right off the bat, you're going to really struggle with this division, as the Sherman Firefly and the Stuart in general are very lightly armored comparatively to their stats and to their price range. Because of this, if the enemy's paying attention to the fact that they're fighting 1st Pancerna, you're going to really struggle. I mean, there are certain ways around it. You could smoke things off. You could also bring things up in bunches. However, you are going to struggle more than any other division, I think. Especially when comparing it to other armored divisions on the Allied side, such as 3rd Spearhead or, more notably, 3rd Tankovy. The usability of having a tank that's all but indestructible by most Axis weapons is not to be overshadowed, and so I feel like the usability of the Sherman goes up in things like 3rd Spearhead, where it has the Sherman Jumbo to take the shots for it, and so it gets to use a lot more of its actual prowess, as it were. That said, to each their own. If you enjoy playing 1st Pancerna, and like I said, you want to use that Firefly, go ahead and use it. I just don't know if I'd recommend this division to newer players, and so because of that, I'd rate this as fairly complex. The Firefly requires a lot of babysitting in order to make work properly. The AA tab isn't fantastic enough that you can just leave it on the map and forget about it, and your AT tab is kind of also in the same boat as the Firefly in that it requires a lot of babysitting. Moving on to 3rd Fallschirmjager and talk about babysitting. Now, let me preface this by saying 3rd Fallschirmjager is one of those decks that's actually just fun to play. It's very interesting. I really enjoy watching all the infantry in this division work, and for the most part, while it's not going to win any awards for its usability, it just leaves me with a smile on my face whenever I play it. In the Recon tab, I led this week off with the SPW AB41 just to have a few more in the way of light cannons that could support my infantry. In Phase B, I brought in the Panzer-Abwehr, and these guys have Panzerschrecks, so they were a no-brainer for me. And in Phase C, I rounded it out with the Sperrtrupp, and the Fallschirmjager Sperrtrupp actually come in with 2 FG42s instead of the typical armament. Because of this, I was bringing them in the half-tracks and using them as more or less support units. However, I found that they were running out of ammo too quickly for my liking. The FG42 has, since its release, received an ammunition buff and still runs out of ammunition faster than any weapon in the game due to its incredible fire rate, and that should tell you right off the bat why I enjoy playing this division so much. In the infantry tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Fallschirmjager, and these guys were quite expensive, I'll give you. However, I brought them in just because they also had that FG42, and so that usability really, I just didn't want to throw it away. On top of that, they did feature smoke rounds, and so it just felt like the best of both worlds, even if it was a bit expensive. I also brought in 2 Phase A cards of the Fallschirmjager at 1-star veterancy. I brought them in at 1 star because I just love these infantry. I want them to be as good as possible, but I brought in 2 cards of them because I was running low on infantry otherwise. I also brought in one of my favorite units in the game in Phase A, and that's the Fallschirm-jager. These guys feature MG42s, they have the FG42, and they have MP44s on top of all that. These things are a premier infantry killing force, and if you catch infantry walking across the open, typically speaking, those infantry will fire maybe 1 shot before they're all vacuumed off the planet. Moving on to Phase B, I have the Luftwaffenjäger, and these guys were just practically Ersatztruppen, except 5 points more expensive and a little bit more usable. I can't really say anything too helpful past that. I rounded out Phase B with a card of the Fallschirmjager at 1 star again, and in Phase C I did the exact same thing as Phase B, just to get more infantry on the field. Now, while this only features 1 more infantry squad than my first Pancerna division did, the infantry themselves trade at such an absurd ratio that 92 infantry is a vast fortune of them compared to 91 Polish infantry. I'll get into more on my thoughts on those later, however, just suffice it to say I adore this infantry tab, even if it is a bit pricey and probably not very usable in a competitive standpoint. In the tank tab, I brought in the Panzer L6 in Phase A, 6 per card, more cannons to help my infantry out, so these felt like a no-brainer to me. I also brought in 2 cards of Phase B Stug 3s, and bringing them both in Phase B was a massive mistake, however, we'll get to that later also. In the support tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Flammenwerfer. These guys are a staple of any division that I make that gets access to them, so should be a no-brainer at this point. A Phase A card of the Kubo munitions, and this is because the FG42 ran out of ammo so quickly that I needed supplies in every phase available for those infantry. And I rounded out Phase A with the Fallschirmjager MG42. As if I needed more ways to kill infantry, I brought in these MG42s to kind of help them along. However, I don't know if I'd keep them in the division if I was to play this more competitively than I was. They were excellent, don't get me wrong, however, I just didn't need any help killing infantry. The infantry were dead before anyone knew about them. In Phase A, I also brought in the Commandant, and fairly typical. In Phase B, however, I brought in the Cuba munitions again and the LG-42. Now, the LG-42 is an interesting unit. For 50 points, you get a 105mm infantry gun that really helps out in those long-ranged engagements. However, it also has heat shells to help out with tanks, and so this could double as an AT weapon should you want it to. The heat doesn't have a tremendous amount of accuracy, and it does have very limited ammunition, so use this at your own discretion. Typically, I would just send this up as an infantry gun, and if it happened to kill the tank, great. Kind of like the same way I use the OB-25s on the Russian side. In the anti-tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Panzerschreck teams, a Phase A card of the Pupchen, and a Phase A card of the Pak-38. Now, two of these are kind of niche. The Panzerschreck teams were mainly because my opware weren't coming in until Phase B, and the Pupchen was to kill IS-2s, namely. Something to note about the Pupchen, while it has an absurdly high penetration, it is locked to a 500-meter range, so you have to be very, very careful using this unit. However, there's almost nothing more satisfying than using your 20-point unit to kill almost a 200-point tank. And so because of this, I just kind of kept it in for the memes, and occasionally I'd get a kill with it, and that was always hugely satisfying. In Phase B, I brought in the Pak-40, and this was just to kind of clench that late-game AT option on top of the 88s that I'd bring in later in the AA tab, so I can't really say anything too bad about this. It oftentimes ended up getting used, so I wouldn't drop it. In the anti-air tab, I brought in the aforementioned Flak 88s in Phases A and B at no star of veterancy. I really like the 88s, especially since they got their availability buffed, and so I've been using these as dual-purpose AT into AA for some time now. While they will dissuade enemy planes, they're very unlikely to kill them even when buffing them up to 2 stars veterancy, and the Flak 36s that I brought in Phase C really didn't help out in the killing planes department. So I found this division, being a Luftwaffe division, kind of struggled a little bit in the aircraft department, which is ironic in a way. However, it didn't do a poor job at it either. I'm just kind of indicting it on its merits. In the artillery tab, I brought in my favorites, the Geb 105s in the supply truck in Phase A, as well as a Phase A 215mm off-map observer. In Phase B, I brought in the Artillery Commander, and at 40 points, these guys are quite decent. They also feature a decent mid-ranged capability that's lacking in a few of the other infantry options in this division. In the Air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the ME-109 GTAC-6 R2s, and these guys were actually really good. At 3 per card in Phase A, coming in at 105 points, their armament is such that it reloads very, very quickly, while still dropping its bombs very, very reliably. So if you use these early on, they oftentimes promoted a sort of rolling scenario that's featured in a few other divisions, however, just kind of leads to a lot of early game aggression. The enemy can't really afford to bring up AA if you're using these properly, because you're bombing out all of their valuable units that they were using to counteract your actual push, and so they have to invest in those again, and then these guys come back in and back in and back in, and without an ally there to bail them out, or some early game AA or ASF shenanigans, these guys typically don't go down. I also brought in a Phase A card of the HS-129 BTAC-2 R3s, and these are probably my least favorite anti-tank planes in the game. They're horridly slow. You can see them coming from 1.5 miles away, and if the enemy player isn't going to back them away, it's because the tank is facing something that's even more dangerous, so oftentimes you're better off just spending the points and getting 2 Pak-40s and just dealing with the tank that way. However, I did use these guys to help out additional fronts or to change the facing of an IS-2 in order to get that side shot on it with something that could kill it on the ground, so that was something. I brought in the lighter caliber version of the HS-129 for this reason though, because the heavier caliber version has less availability, is a bit more expensive, and I think is a little less usable to show for it. In Phase B, I brought in the Ju-88 STAC-1s, and in Phase C, I brought in another card of the same thing. These were fine. For 95 points, I don't think I could imagine anything better, but they're certainly no PE2s. Rightfully so, as the PE2 is quite a bit more expensive, however, I just feel like these were kind of lackluster in their department. I think I'd keep them in, even in a competitive scenario, however, they weren't really selling themselves on their 95-point price tag. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, and a few changes right off the bat in the Recon tab. I've dropped the SPW-41s in favor of 2 cards of Scharfschütze in phases A and B. These come at a Force 2-star veterancy, and have the access of some heavier transports. However, I just opted for the Horsch for the speed. I did this because the Sperrtrupp and the SPW were fantastic at their job. However, I found that I really was lacking sort of sniper support, and so I swapped over to these guys, and it actually ended up helping quite a bit. The infantry tab saw no changes, as I absolutely adored the way it was working already. However, the tank tab saw me dropping one of the Stug 3 cards to Phase A because I had no way to deal with tanks in Phase A from a front-facing position. The Stug 3 would have been an excellent choice for some of the early games I played. However, all I had access to was the L6, and that was a very stressful couple games, to say the least. Bringing the Stug 3 to Phase A was a no-brainer, and I don't know why I didn't do it to begin with. In the support tab, I ended up dropping the Phase B card of Cugal Munitions, which may or may not have been a mistake, in favor of a Phase A card of the LG-42. The LG-42 was fantastic, don't get me wrong. However, I did run out of ammo quite a few times, so it's kind of hit and miss. I was relying heavily on winning the game before getting too far into Phase C, and so I think this deployment in the support tab at the very least would have worked a lot better as a Vanguard or Maverick deployment rather than the current balanced deployment. However, that's neither here nor there. The anti-tank and anti-air tabs saw no changes, although I did make a few changes throughout the week, just none of them stuck. I just ended up going back. Same with the artillery and air tabs, but these actually saw no changes throughout the week. Let me get the cons out of the way for this division right off the bat so that I can get into why I enjoy playing this division altogether. This deck is very, very specific. You can't take this division onto an open field easily, and so you're kind of locked to either fighting for forests or towns, and in multiplayer games where you're not playing with people that you know, it oftentimes leads to frustration if you're relegated to fighting for an open field. On top of that, you have no usable tank support. The Stug 3 is excellent, but you don't get a lot of them, so you don't really end up getting any sort of superiority in that realm. On top of this, the AT tab is kind of lackluster, just in its lack of availability, not in its lack of usability. The units themselves are excellent, but you just don't get enough of them to really create a real defensive line. And then there's the cost of everything. This division is so expensive. The Fallschirmjager are your line infantry and cost 35 points each. 40 points for some of the more usable infantry. You have 35 points for the Panzer-Abwehr. You have 50 points for the LG-42, so on and so forth. This division just costs an excessive amount of points to actually field. All of the units require an excessive amount of micromanaging, and if the enemy has really good counter battery and actual artillery micro, then you're just going to really struggle with this division. The Fallschirmjager do not push through artillery very well. However, and this is a big however, this is one of the most fun divisions to play in this game, period. The Fallschirmjager perform excellently. In the absence of any enemy artillery or enemy tank support, which is rare albeit, but bear with me here. In the absence of those things, the Fallschirmjager will kill their weight in gold of enemy infantry. I think a Fallschirmjager squad left to its own devices will go easily 4-1 before it runs out of ammunition, and if you have good ammunition micro, it will easily go 8-1 before it's slain. That's not even to mention the Fallschirm-Sturmjäger, which I have personally seen vacuum at least 12 squads per squad off the map each time that I bring them forward. All it takes is moving these guys around to avoid enemy battery and making sure they're well supplied, and these things will really just take on an autonomy of their own. They're probably the only infantry in the game that I really just trust to beat enemy infantry, whereas you're typically pitting your Panzergrenadier up against Guardia, and maybe they win, maybe they don't, maybe there's 2 Guardia squads, so on and so forth. With the Fallschirmjager, there's no such concern. If you're pitting the Fallschirmjager against something and they have ammo for the FG-42, typically they will win that fight. 9 times out of 10 without any other support. While there are a few exceptions to this, such as sometimes Automachiki will beat them in close quarters, Tanko Desaniki will stun them out, so on and so forth, for the most part, at that mid-range or even that 300-meter close range, these guys are unstoppable gods. Because of that, it's just so much fun to watch them work. These things will just completely obliterate enemy infantry, and I can't really hammer that point home enough. On top of that, their support tab is absolutely fantastic. The LG-42, even though it's expensive, will kill enemy tanks and enemy infantry alike, and harass them from such a range as to be a little ridiculous. The MG-42 is always a staple of any Axis division, and so that's really a no-brainer there too. And on top of this, they don't lack for Flammenwerfer, so they're able to take those close-quarters forests without too much trouble. In the AA tab, they have access to the 88s, which are just excellent. If you only have a few AA guns, but they're 88s, that's just absolutely fantastic. It also has access to the Flak 38s if you really want to hammer home your AA superiority, so you could probably drop a card at the JU-88s in favor of those if you wanted to maintain that late-game AA superiority. Their artillery tab is a little lackluster, but still features a decent Phase A artillery observer as well as the Geb 105s, and has the battery Führer to provide that mid-game and late-game infantry support, though you could drop the battery Führer in favor of the Luftwaffe Führer if you were feeling like swapping it back over to the infantry tab. On top of all this, the Luftwaffe Jäger are actually quite good at just being line infantry and taking the shots that I would normally have the Ersatztruppen take, in that I don't have to spend 35 points on a unit, but it will still perform admirably, even though it only costs 20 points. To give this deck a rating, however, I would say it is kind of mechanically difficult to play. It requires that you're on a specific front, it requires that your teammates make up for your lacks in your other areas, and it doesn't do well the fewer players in the game that it has. Because of its inherent expense to bring in any one unit, it kind of really doesn't lend itself toward 1v1 play, I would imagine, either. While a case could be made to play this in 1v1s, I think it would be quite difficult just given the cost of the units and the current meta of the game. I could be wrong there, however. I did find that in 2v2s, this division did struggle quite a lot for that very same reason. It was just very difficult to cover the entire front without stretching myself too thin, it felt like. In 3v3s and 4v4s, though, there was always an ally there to make up for my weaknesses, and because of that, this deck really did shine in those situations, that I wasn't relegated to fighting for an open field. However, that does lead me to probably the biggest detractor from this division, and that's that it lacks any sort of diversity. You have to take a forest or a city, the end. There's no other option. If you take an open field, sure, you can hold your own, but you're not going to be doing any pushing, that's for sure. Quite a few times throughout the week, I was relegated to this position, and it is inherently frustrating to try and fight for an open ground with things like 3rd Fallschirmjager, 3rd VDV, or so on. And so I will say that while this deck is one of the most fun divisions in the game, I would advise only playing it with people that you know, or people that you know will compensate for your flaws. If you jump into a game and you see that there are already 2 or 3 infantry divisions on your team, maybe don't play this, because you're all going to be vying for the same locations. All that said, that is going to do it for this week in review of 1st Pancerna and 3rd Fallschirmjager. Sorry it got a bit long there, but I had a lot to say about these 2 divisions. However, thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned something.